to at modernchi.org. And yeah, you can find more about me. And also, I am here to champion your next move. And I love to host these talks. There will be more of these talks to come. And today I have Jolie Chan here with us. So let me just jump over to her so that she can intro herself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to chat today. I'm really excited, and thank you, Katy, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. My name is Jolie. I'm a life and leadership coach, and I guide women and femmes of color to embrace life seasons and let their values take the lead. I come from a 7-year experience that's mixed with marketing and higher education, but predominantly in higher education. And my main responsibilities there were to supervise students, but what ended up being a mentorship and leadership opportunity to work with students on their confidence building and self-advocacy. And yeah, as you can see on the screen, I'm in Boston, which is what I was saying before. The weather has quickly transitioned from summer to fall, which is very classic New England. I also have a little puppy named Basil. And during my free time, I love fall. So this is like my heyday. This is my season. This is my favorite time. But I also love drinking matcha, making kombucha, baking bread, things like that. And as it says there, rearranging my apartment because quarantine or pandemic or whatever you want to call it has forced me to nest quite a bit.
I know when we first met, I dropped into your matcha hour, and it was really cool to be able to chat with you and also have just go to this event that is different from a coffee chat.
Yeah, I used to host for those who may not be familiar, I used to host a 1-hour conversation just because I was feeling really lonely during the pandemic, and I had started my business during the pandemic and was looking to just connect with more women and femmes of color. And unfortunately, I put a pause on hosting those conversations for now, but I'm excited and curious to see how community will be infused in my current venture.
Cool. So today we're talking about self-acceptance and leadership. So the themes are the guidelines to tap into personal values and become confident in your leadership, tools to navigate different seasons of life and find a place of enoughness in yourself. Also, how to use storytelling as a tool to leverage your past and envision your future life. And we are here at the Chat and Learn. Sorry about that. So let me just stop sharing here. And let's get into the questions that we have prepared for you. For someone who is not in a leadership role managing a large team, is self-acceptance in leadership relevant? Can we apply leadership lessons to everything we do?
I would say so. I mean, to me, I think for a very long time, I saw leadership as like something that was strictly in the workplace. And something that I've been working on unlearning is how capitalism has been really ingrained in my everyday, and recognizing that so leadership, I actually looked up the definition because I was curious to know how someone like a very structured dictionary would define it. And without using the word leadership is actually just the influence and the guidance that you have over other people or a group of people. And it doesn't say anything about how it can be limited to the workplace. So I personally think that by accepting who we are and ourselves is a way to show up as our authentic and genuine selves in leadership, whether it can be in the workplace, of course, but it also can be in your family or the support systems that you have or the community groups that you're a part of. So leadership can show up in so many ways because it really is about the impact that you have on other people.
The impact you have on other people. Okay. And yeah, next up we have this, because we are focused on women and femme of color not being sought out and seen as leader. Why is that happening, and how does family conditioning play a role into this?
I mean, quite frankly, the reason why women and femmes of color are not sought out for leadership positions are the patriarchy, heteronormativity, capitalism, things like that. And we live in a society that idolizes and prioritizes that traditional like white man in leadership. And I think as women and femmes of color, it's an ongoing journey for us to recognize that we also have the skills and values to be leaders as well. There's a lot of misogyny, internalized misogyny that exists in leadership. And then can you remind me the second half of the question?
Yeah, so does family conditioning play a role in this leadership development?
Yeah, so I can't speak for everyone, and but I know that oftentimes families and the support systems that we exist in can impact how we see ourselves as leaders. So coming from personal experience, like I grew up in a immigrant households. I'm Hong Kong Chinese American, which I believe, Katy, you are too. And I grew up in a culture that told me to kind of like put my head down, don't make too much of a commotion, just like follow the rules, follow what other people say. And that kind of put me in this little corner to myself where I was like, okay, well, like, I'm just going to do what everyone tells me to do. And I don't need to be a leader. I don't need to be seen. Like, I just need to, especially in the workplace, because, in immigrant culture, there's that theme of like survivalism. Like in the workplace, I was told like, just don't make too much of a fuss, like just earn the paycheck, come home, and that's it. So I do think that family dynamics can definitely have an impact on how we show up and how we perceive ourselves as leaders, because we have that influence telling us like, no, like you don't need to take up space. Like we don't want to bring too much attention to ourselves, because like we can just follow the rules and that's enough.
Yes, yeah, well, I think we had this conversation before, so I I I feel the sentiment, and also, so now I would love to ask you about how do we move beyond the feelings and the experiences of not being sought out and seen as leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love some clarification on the question too. Like, what do you mean by move beyond? Like, how do we overcome, or how do we um, like what can we do instead? What's the
Maybe I am thinking about like what are the tools or continue processes that we can keep practicing and working on so that we especially just do not pass it on to the next generation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that in the society that we live in, especially as women and femmes of color, we're often told that we're not enough. Or sometimes in the conversations that I've had with my community, it's also that you're too much. So for example, like, oh, you're too quiet, or actually you're too loud, or you're too nice or you're too angry. And I think we often hear these criticisms and held to a different standard than, cis men or white women, for example. So I think it's important to start to look inward, which is where the storytelling piece comes in, which I know is highlighted in this conversation. But doing that identity work and understanding that we as humans, regardless of what we identify as, are inherently worthy and have value. And that's when we start to apply for different opportunities, for example, right? If we're talking about the workplace or just like showing up as our genuine selves. So for example, like there anecdotally, I don't have statistics on this, but I know that like it's often men, when they're applying for jobs, may not question like, am I qualified for this role, right? Like, oh, I don't have the exact experience that is required for this application, but I'm just going to apply anyway. But I know often for women and femmes of color who are constantly talked down and their experiences can be reduced to less kind of, I shouldn't say kind of, like second guess ourselves on whether or not we should even put ourselves out there, when the reality is if we put ourselves out there, then the worst that someone can say is no. Right. So recognizing that we don't need to wait for affirmation or validation from other people to see ourselves as leaders, because like I said, all of us in some way, shape, or form in our lives are seen as a leader, whatever, in personal circles, in professional circles.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And it, to me, the example that I have is if I know more about some area, then someone else knows less. So then in that case, I could be the leader for them to help them get to the next level of where they want to go and what they want to learn from me. And that's how I see it. So yeah, thanks
Yeah,
for
I
that.
mean, yeah, we all have our unique experiences. We all have our own story, and we all bring so much to the table. But oftentimes, again, like we think that like being a leader or being someone who is worth looking up to, for example, not to put hierarchy on it, but like what's the word I'm looking for? Just the phrasing. We like, oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. Well, what I'm trying to say is that we like all bring something to the table and we have something to share. And just because someone has told us throughout our lives that it's not worth it, or like that's not good enough, or whatever it is, like doesn't mean that is not reality. You know, that is someone who is scared to lose their power in the society, and recognize that like we bring such diverse experiences to the table, and all of that is really important to share. All of us have something important to share.
Okay. We have the next question come through is, can you share what enoughness means to you? Is this unique to the individual? And how can we work to identify what it means for each of us?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To me, when I say that I'm enough, it means that literally as I exist is enough. I don't need to be a certain way or act a certain way to be considered of value, right? So like in a capitalistic society, we have placed a lot of value on the labor and our production and our output. But in reality, even if I'm choosing to rest today or whatever it is, like in the present moment, I'm choosing to rest, I'm still enough as a human. Like I don't need to do anything to prove myself or my value to anyone. And then if this concept is unique to the individual, how can we work to identify what that means for each of us? And I think, I mean, I think that's it, right? Like there is no, it is a unique concept, but recognizing that like you don't need to keep working and working and working just to prove something to someone that you are enough, right? Like, who are you trying to prove yourself to? And what standards are we holding ourselves to? How are those where did those standards come from? Is it based on your own individual desires, or is this based on something that someone else has told you is necessary or required of you to just exist?
Mhm. Yeah, and also with resting, it's not like we're not doing anything. It's a recovery so that we can prepare for the next thing. And um, yeah.
It's recovery, and it's just we all inherently need it, right?
Mhm.
Like if we
Yeah.
break it down, like we all require some level of sleep every single day. But rest can come in a lot of forms. It's not necessarily just sleeping. It's because we exist in a society, like I said, that requires and asks and demands so much output from us. And I'm speaking specifically to the US. I know that this exists everywhere, but it's a means of survival, unfortunately, right? Like we need to labor in order to receive financial compensation so that we can provide for food and shelter for ourselves. And that's really hard.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Letting that one sink in. And I want to ask you about the title, which is you have paired self-acceptance with leadership. And I want to see if we can dive in deeper for why you chose to pair the two self-acceptance with leadership.
Yeah. So in my practice with life and leadership coaching, I thought to myself for a long time, like, why these two paths really speak to me. And in leadership, especially the way that society has labeled it as, it felt like for me, and I could see this happening for a lot of folks, that I felt like I had to be someone different. So, for example, like my whole life, I was told I was really quiet and like didn't have a lot to add to the conversation, when in reality, I had a lot of things that I wanted to share and a lot of things that I wanted to bring up, but I've rarely been in an environment that has encouraged that conversation. And in terms of the quietness, again, like I was so often intimidated. And again, like kind of fitting myself into that stereotype of an East Asian woman, right, who is quiet and meek and stays like in her lane, sticks to herself, whatever it is. And I recognize that like these qualities that we've paired with leadership aren't always like, especially in a patriarchal hierarchical society, leadership doesn't look one way. It doesn't look like it's, I often see it as someone who's loud, often a cis white man, often of dominance, top down structure, things like that. And I want to guide women and femmes of color on this journey of like understanding who you are, what your personal values are, and how you can still show up as a leader. Because again, we all have that leadership title in a lot of areas of our lives, at least one area of our life, right? And understanding like how we want to take those values and bring that to leadership.
This, I feel like you have already been talking through this while you're explaining the pairing of self-acceptance leadership, but I do want to ask you maybe the most challenging thing. You can let me know if you've already answered that. for self-acceptance and leadership for yourself and then for the clients you've worked with?
Yeah, so I think so. I ran a workshop on leadership earlier this year, and I asked a couple of guiding questions for my group. And one of them was like, name, 3 to 5 leaders. And then asked them again, like, what do they look like? Like, what is it that makes them a leader? What are those qualities? And then the other question that I asked was, what qualities do you think make a good leader? And I think for a lot of folks on that call started to become really surprised because they were not the traditional qualities of leadership. So I had one of my clients share that creativity came to mind. And that's really often not something that we would necessarily align with leadership in, again, these patriarchal structures. But it was a really awakening moment for them because they were like, I never really recognized this as a strength, as something that can enhance my leadership skills. But by being creative, I can be someone who is innovative in the way that I cultivate community or create community. And that was really special to see that moment and witness that moment and be like, yeah, you don't have to be someone that you're not to be seen as, again, valued and worthy in a leadership role.
I love it. And it led me to think while you were talking about how speaking calmly in a calm way, not being loud is actually, I mean, it's just a different style of leadership.
Mhm.
And as Asian women, we're not like all the same. There are definitely the ones who their personality is loud and that's just who they are. So it's great for you to open that discussion up. Yeah. And now let's go to vulnerability. It's a hot topic. Brene Brown. And so your thoughts and how do you see it, vulnerability differing from weakness?
Okay, so I have really strong opinions about this. um, I don't see vulnerability as a weakness. That's another, I mean, I don't know if I try to steer away from like binary concepts. But in more masculine leadership, it's kind of like serious, closed off, like nothing personal. And that's part of what makes you a strong leader. And I think this feminine leadership concept is that vulnerability, there's more that nurturing and empathetic side to leadership. Um, so forgive me for not having a more what's the word I'm looking for? Like expansive way of talking about this, but that's just kind of the definitions as I've seen in like official terms. But I don't see vulnerability as a weakness, but I do bring caution to vulnerability because I think that in social media, especially, uh, people, okay, I'm trying to organize my thoughts so it's not all over the place. Social media has conditioned a lot of us to want instantaneous response and to be an affirming platform based on the likes, the saves, the shares, right? Like it's all like a vanity. These are all vanity metrics. And people appreciate vulnerability because it makes you more human, right? Like I don't, again, have statistics on this, but like people are craving this personalization, this personal experience and connection with other people. And I think that it can sometimes be tricky to be vulnerable in that space. And I only say that because it's never really in our favor to process on social media. Like being vulnerable just because you think you have to be vulnerable, right? There's kind of like that inception there. And the reason why I say that is because like we don't want to be vulnerable for the sake of that those vanity metrics and that validation. However, with that being said, I always want to caveat with that because that's when things can get a little bit tricky. Vulnerability is allowing us to show our humanity and be genuine with others, because it's not that fun or exciting to see a leader who can't express that side of themselves, because that's where trust comes in, right? Like knowing that this person behind whatever is a human being and they have feelings and they have empathy and compassion. Because what we're looking for is someone that we can build trust with and create connection. So for me, I don't see vulnerability as a weakness, but like I said, like with the element of social media, I always tell folks like, I don't want that to be the space where you like outwardly process without having sat with your own feelings, because there is so much importance to us evaluating and reflecting for ourselves first, right? Like social media is asking us to create for others and to slow things down and prioritize presence. I always say like, take that time for yourself before putting it out and sharing it with the world. And then kind of, it's hard not to let the vanity metrics affect how you show up in that way, because eventually that ends up being inauthentic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I feel like what I'm hearing is take time to reflect and process your own feelings first. And it doesn't make any sense to just go out and be vulnerable with everyone and anyone without really understanding the lesson that you personally want to take away from it. Is
Mhm.
that where you were headed?
Yeah, I mean, this looks like the next question that you're asking too, a little bit of it, but um, vulnerability doesn't mean that you have to be a complete open book. I think as human beings, we should be setting boundaries for ourselves. Boundary setting is super important. So it's not about like, oh, I have to be vulnerable and share like all the inner personal details of my life. It's like, no, that's not it. But to give you an example, I used to be in an environment where there was a leader on our team who would just kind of dance around like the reality of a situation that was happening. And I would always comment like, about the situation that like this leader tended to like uh fly the plane in a circle before like landing it. I'm like totally butchering that analogy, but like I felt like she was talking in circles and then would just land at like the reality of the situation. I'm like, everyone would be so confused, like how did we get here, like, and I think a part of the vulnerability is just like honesty and transparency of the situation. Um, so yeah, vulnerability doesn't mean that you have to give everyone your all, like all of you. It just means that offering a sense of, I think humanity is at the core of what I'm saying, I guess, since I keep saying it over and over again.
Yeah, this next one may help. It's a similar question, but the topic is switched from vulnerability to authenticity, which just from hearing your last response, I'm hearing more of maybe let's acknowledge what the reality is right now
Mhm.
first, before just rushing to something else or the solution or whatever it may be. Um, Yeah, so I think like really taking a look also at what authenticity means. It's not just a buzzword. It's like really just seeing things for what it is right now, maybe. You have to help me with this.
Yeah, so authenticity is definitely a buzzword. And I always get a little bit sad when this happens because sometimes like things end up losing their luster a little bit when they're overused. But harnessing authenticity. So this is a slightly tricky one because I want to acknowledge that there are still oppressive systems in place, right? And even though workplaces, and I keep defaulting back to workplace because I think that's where the lines get a little bit blurrier, but we are told like you can show up as your authentic self, like that's what we want to see. But especially as women and femmes of color, once we start doing that, we're often criticized for it, or told that like that's inappropriate. For example, like how we wear our hair, how we might be too loud, for example, like our volume. And but that can be someone's authentic self, right? But somehow that's not seen as appropriate. And that's when I want to disclaimer that and say that like, yes, like I would love to see more of us as women and femmes of color to show up as our genuine selves, but knowing that it's not always safe to do so. Um, so when thinking about authenticity, I know that this is a question that we had discussed earlier, or I should say brief prior to this conversation, Katy, but thinking about like having a seat at the table, right? Like who is telling us can we belong or not? And is it because of the way that we're showing up as our authentic selves? And thinking about who is creating that standard.
Yeah, I don't want to generalize. This is something that does come up and is challenging for some, but not for others.
Mhm.
But yes, some with this challenge that some people feel that they do not belong at the table. How can I overcome this feeling?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so like I was mentioning before, like I was saying before, who created that table and who is deciding whether or not we belong? And how can we reclaim that power? Because the conversation about the table is that like trying to fit in the mold of like white supremacy culture. And the conversation that I'm really loving lately is like, how can we start our own table? Because that puts the priority and the influence and impact of in this conversation, I'm speaking to this conversation specifically as women and femmes of color, because sometimes, again, I don't want to speak for everyone in this experience, but like, I don't want to try and fit into that mold, right? Like, I don't want to try and I don't want to be a token, first of all, like, I don't want to be the token person at the table. And I also don't want to fit into the mold of someone else's table and work. And again, trying to keep proving myself to other folks to try and affirm and validate my identity when I don't necessarily need that. So I think that's just an important, I don't know if there's necessarily like overcome in this situation. Like, I'm not sure if it's that's the right way, or excuse me. I don't know if that's the way that I would like to approach the situation, or encourage others to do so, because again, that kind of ends up centering the white lens of the conversation, but yeah, I think it's more like, what are my priorities in becoming the leader that I want to be, that feels genuine, so that I can continue to create trust and connection with others.
I love this. I love where we're going because my mind is latching on then, yeah, what's the narrative that we're creating for like what we're hearing that's coming from the outside about the table, and then where do we like individually want to take it and go and take ownership or have confidence to lead the way of what the table means or what kind of table you want. So this person asked, what does storytelling mean in a professional context? And if you're able to provide an example off the top of your mind or something, how have you done this in the past in the workplace? Yeah.
Yeah, I think storytelling can occur in a variety of ways in a professional context. The first thing that comes to my mind is often job interviews, applying for new or different roles. And, like when you're asked like those traditional questions of like, tell me about a time that you were challenged in this kind of way, or tell me a story about XYZ. That's when storytelling comes into place. And I've been in a lot of interviews because I used to be a supervisor, and I've supervised like probably 200 plus students, staff members. And the important piece of the story is having a beginning, middle, and end. And I know that sounds so basic, and things that we might have learned in like grade school or elementary school. But it's important to have like the kind of like the lesson, right? Like the lesson of the story pieced in when you're telling that story of, how you overcame XYZ challenge. And in terms of leadership, if that is the direction of the question that I think could be underlying here, I think we always like, I think that we are constantly sharing our stories, right, in a personal context. And I think in a professional context, again, like there's that mix of vulnerability in there. Like as someone's supervisor and manager, like how are you creating trust with your mentees or your employees? Because typically people don't respond well to like top-down structure. It makes people feel small. And how can we use our stories to make them feel seen and heard, and know that by opening up your story, they can also have space to tell their own too. And I think I want to add one more thing to this, is like, I think that people think that stories are like these long-winded things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be. We see that in an Instagram caption. That's a really short story, compared to like the larger story. It's just a small piece of it.
I want to ask you if when we're introing ourselves and just doing the pitch, maybe, I don't know, for a minute, is that considered also storytelling in a way?
Yeah, I think that can be. An elevator pitch is slightly more strategic, I think, just because it's condensed, and usually you're trying to market yourself in some kind of way. So there are structures to make it flow and feel like more like a storytelling experience. But yeah, stories can be definitely valuable in an elevator pitch.
Yeah. Planning for the future, how often should I periodically evaluate and update the most recent iteration of my story?
Wow, this is a really cool question. So storytelling is a really valuable tool, and stories are ways that we've been able to connect with our past. Stories are also passed down from generation to generation, right? And there's also, so there's a past and a present and a future tense in storytelling. So, right, like, so our stories, there's our stories of our past, how we came to be, what's our lineage, like what was our childhood like, things like that. And then present moment storytelling is curating like your everyday, like how do you want to feel, what are your values, what are your priorities. And then for future pacing with storytelling is what do I envision for myself, for the future, for my community in the future. And I don't know if there's actually an answer to this question. It's really up to you, like whatever feels good. Like my story's always changing. I pivoted my business when Katy, you and I first connected about Power to Fly. I was a different business model. I was promoting something different and relevant to what I still talk about now. But I had a moment where I was like, something doesn't feel right. And I think when things are starting to feel disconnected and off pace for where you're at right now, that's often a good time to check in with yourself and say, like, is this the story that I want to keep building? Or do I want to make adjustments?
Mhm. So now it's just looking forward and looking ahead, back towards more of the leadership. And so this person asks, like, they have a collection of skills, patterns, lessons learned along the way. Should I identify a style to follow or be developing my own? I think it's the leadership style.
Okay. I'm just going to read it off the screen. Is this question relevant to like, how do I tell my story with this collection of skills and patterns?
I think um, this person maybe just feels like, well, don't, maybe I don't feel like I am um, a leader yet, or I don't have a particular leadership style. And
Mm.
maybe is there a way to, should I be looking at a role model and then just following along with what they do and then
Mm.
practice what they do, or be working on my own style? Be, I, I know, I think they are already answering their own question as well, because they have a collection of skills, patterns, and lessons learned along the way.
Yeah. And I think, okay, so I want to um, add another layer to the conversation because um, there's often, so we talked about enoughness, right? We talked about our inherent value as human beings. And I want the audience and anyone who's watching to recognize that, like, this doesn't mean that there's no room for expansion. I'm not saying that there's no room to discover and explore and learn from other people, right? Because like we are coming from our own perspective and lens. So I want to say that to start. However, we all have our unique strengths. I don't know if anyone's familiar, but I used to be a big proponent of the Gallup Strengths Finder. It's like a personality quiz, but it's basically saying like, here are the top 32 strengths that we've like kind of identified in different corners. I believe there are 4 different themes. And these are all strengths of ours. However, we do have top 5 out of these 32, so, or 36 or whatever it is. And how can we harness what we have? And we all have such unique top 5s out of that. And just because we have our bottom 5, for example, leadership skills, doesn't mean that that's not something that we can seek to improve on if we would wish. And it doesn't mean that that is irrelevant. So I wanted to put some of those things out there. But like you said, I do think that we all have, again, something unique to bring to the table. And I it's important to recognize that, again, just because you don't look a certain way or act a certain way doesn't mean that you can't show up. And have, again, I want to break it down to the basics of what leadership is defined as, is influence and guidance over others.
Influence and guidance over others. Okay. And now I want to ask you your ideal vision for inclusive and conscious leadership.
Yeah. My ideal vision is that, one, I think the root of all of this is compassion for other folks. Far too often have I seen leadership dynamics where the leader seizes that opportunity to leverage power that may not be appropriate, or it makes the other humans in that group feel like they're not important, they're not valued, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I mean, inclusivity, I think the root of that is being compassionate for other people and understanding that there is no standard way that makes someone a better person, like a better human, just because, again, they have a certain skin color, they have a certain faith, or income status, or whatever it is. And then for conscious leadership is recognizing, again, like what your community is asking for and what they really need. I think it's really important to trust the people and include others in your leadership, because I think, again, it can feel like leader up here and then everyone else down here, when really you could be leader here and then everyone else is kind of with you here. And you can be a leader. Here's an analogy, is that you can be a leader at the front of the classroom and you can be a leader at the back of the classroom. Everyone, like, my position as a leader can always flip-flop between other people. So when I was working with students, I often told them, like, I know I'm your supervisor, but your ideas and the conversations that you bring to the table are also really important. And if there's something that you have concerns about, you want to reflect changes that you think could improve our team as a whole, please bring them up. And there are things that I can learn from you too. So that's my vision for inclusive and conscious leadership, is recognizing that, like, I am not better than the other. One is not better than the other. How can I approach this from a human, compassionate perspective? And I can only hope that people start to recognize that that's how we create actual change in society, is like listening to each other and what we want and need.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe you just shared what your ideas are for servant leadership, but if there's more that you want to dive into with your last share for working with the people that you're leading to come to continue to listen to the community that you're serving. If there's more to add for the servant leadership.
I'm not sure if there's much more that I want to add. But again, like, hierarchies have always, like, it always sat the wrong way with me, because as we move through, like, and I want to emphasize that, like, I don't know if hierarchies will ever stop existing. And I think there are natural hierarchies. Like, if we think about a food chain, that is theoretic, like, that is a hierarchy, right? But at the same time, like, there is a loss. I'm going to backtrack there. I have sensed a loss of understanding of what is needed at every level of the hierarchy, right? And it just always bothered me that like the more someone moved up and moved on, it felt like there was a disconnect for the experience for others or those who might be earlier in their experience. So it just created this unnecessary power dynamic, right? And thinking that like, well, because I see myself as a leader in this situation, I know better, I know more. When really we are far more impactful when we come from like a community approach versus like I'm the visionary and we do as I say because I know all or I have X experience. So yeah, that's just something that I've seen is more effective is like when we can come from like a collective versus the individual.
I love it so much that you are telling us to see the value in the people who are not as far along the way as we are in some area, and they are continuously seeing a different side of the whole thing. It's like even like a outside perspective at times, and pointing out things that we aren't aware of for the people who are further along. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why storytelling is such a core, right? Because we all come from different backgrounds and experiences and have witnessed so many different things in our lives that have shaped our values. And we talked about that before, right? Like values-based leadership and like we all carry different priorities and our values can always be shifting and that's okay.
Yeah, we're towards the wrapping up. So, are there tools and resources for self-acceptance and leadership that we can go to?
I personally have been the most impacted by the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. Have you read it?
No, not yet. Yeah, it's on my
Um,
list.
yeah, it comes from a transformative justice perspective and aligns. It doesn't market itself as a leadership book. However, there is so much in it that ends up being like it. Okay, I don't want to give it away because it's such a beautiful book and it's so hard to explain in just like a few sentences for me, but especially the impact that it had on me. But there's so much that we can actually take from nature and apply that to how we, I don't want to say run because that sounds like, again, like a power dynamic thing, but like how we approach our communities and society and how we treat other people, which sounds so basic. But I think a lot of that is lost when we have the influences of these oppressive systems that we've covered today. So I highly recommend that book because it doesn't, again, necessarily touch upon the terms word for word, but I've found a lot of peace and clarity when reading this book.
Mhm. Oh, that's so cool. I love it. It's yeah, I'm gonna be reading that soon. Thank you so much for the reminder and sharing that with the group. Where can people find you and stay in touch and reach out if there are more questions that haven't been covered today?
Yeah, so you can find me at rootandcultivate.com. My Instagram is also root and cultivate. And if you want to connect via LinkedIn, it's under my personal full name, Jolie Chan. What I'm working on right now, so I'm in development of some new offers, but some of the existing services for my community are I have a weekly voice note newsletter where I share basically like a mini podcast. It's like 3 to 5 minutes long of just like things that have been coming to mind lately about like these themes that we've covered today. And it's an experimental way for me to converse and connect with my community. And I've been really excited about the feedback so far. And I also offered 90-minute empowered leadership sessions where we cover everything that we talked about today. I also use my signature leadership framework, HOME or HOME, in guiding those conversations. But yeah, that's the best way to keep in touch with me, stay connected, and trying to remember if there's any more social media platforms. That's like my main platform is Instagram, but I'll be putting more content on my website really soon as well.
Wonderful. And also, yeah, any closing thoughts for the discussion, the conversation that we've had today? Anything that's jumping out at you right now, or something that you want to let the group know before we close out?
Yeah, I think it's not because I'm saying it, but I just want everyone to remember that you are inherently worthy, you bring value, and you are enough as you exist today. Like, I know that it's such a tricky place to call myself a life coach, a leadership coach, because there can be the connotation that you need to better yourself or improve yourself, when in reality, the way that I want to approach it is that there's a lot of self-acceptance, and you don't necessarily have to change to be a better version of yourself. But yeah, you are worthy and valuable and valued as a human being just by being who you are.
Okay, great, amazing. And I'm glad you tied it back to the enoughness. Yeah, for anyone who wants to reach out to me and become the next speaker, feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and for Jolie Chan, for you to join me here today. I really appreciate you so much, and hope that we can continue our connection and talk some more as we go along. And totally welcome to come back to talk about a different topic, next thing that you're working on. Yeah.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Katie, and everyone who joined. We appreciate it.
Yeah. See you all next time. Bye.